It was supposed to be just another night in Paris, the kind that ends quietly with headlights fading into sleep, but instead it became one of the most haunting moments of modern history. On August 31st, 1997, the world woke up to the news that Diana, Princess of Wales, was dead, and almost instantly, disbelief turned into grief, and grief into questions that have never fully gone away. Diana was not just royalty. She was a global figure who had redefined what it meant to be a public woman with private pain. Her death did not feel distant or ceremonial. It felt personal, like losing someone who had been quietly present in millions of lives. To understand why her death still provokes such intensity, you have to understand who Diana was and what she represented. She entered the British royal family as a shy, young kindergarten teacher and emerged as the most photographed woman on the planet. From the very beginning, she struggled inside an institution built on restraint, tradition, and emotional silence. Diana, by contrast, was expressive, empathetic, and visibly human. She touched AIDS patients when others would not, walked through landmine fields to draw attention to forgotten wars, and spoke openly about bulimia, depression, and loneliness at a time when such honesty was considered unthinkable for royalty. This openness earned her immense public love and deep institutional discomfort. Her marriage to Prince Charles deteriorated in full view of the world, becoming a slow-motion collapse documented by tabloids and television cameras. The divorce in 1996 did not remove her from the spotlight. In fact, it intensified it. Diana was now independent, freer in theory, but more exposed than ever. She was still pursued relentlessly by photographers, still analyzed for every outfit, every smile, every companion. The press did not just report on Diana. It chased her, surrounded her, and profited endlessly from her visibility. This dynamic would prove fatal. On the night of the crash, Diana was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, the son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed. Their relationship was new, highly publicized, and intensely scrutinized. That evening, they left the Ritz Hotel shortly after midnight, attempting to evade paparazzi who had gathered outside. What followed was a high-speed drive through the streets of Paris, ending in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The Mercedes struck a pillar. Dodi Fayed and the driver, Henri Paul, died instantly. Diana was still alive when emergency services arrived, but she succumbed to her injuries hours later at the hospital. From the moment the facts emerged, controversy followed. Why was the car traveling so fast? Why was there no seat belt? Why did it take so long to reach the hospital? Why were paparazzi allowed to pursue the vehicle? These questions were not irrational. They were the natural result of a public that had watched Diana be hunted by cameras for years. And if you are already feeling that familiar chill of doubt, maybe it is time to subscribe, because this story does not get simpler from here. Official investigations concluded that the primary cause of the crash was reckless driving and alcohol impairment. Henri Paul, the driver, was found to have alcohol levels significantly above the legal limit. The inquest also cited excessive speed and the aggressive pursuit by paparazzi as contributing factors. On paper, the explanation was straightforward, almost disappointingly so. A tragic accident, fueled by human error and media pressure. Case closed. Except the world was not convinced, and for many, it still is not. Part of the skepticism stems from the sheer scale of Diana's influence. This was not a private citizen involved in a late-night crash. This was a woman whose every movement carried symbolic weight, whose conflicts with the royal family were public, and whose future seemed increasingly independent of royal control. Diana had spoken openly about feeling threatened, about believing that powerful forces wanted to silence her. Letters surfaced in which she expressed fear of an orchestrated accident. Whether these fears were grounded or the result of prolonged stress remains debated, but they added fuel to a fire that was already burning. Mohammed Al Fayed, devastated by the loss of his son, became the most vocal opponent of the official narrative. He claimed that Diana and Dodi were victims of a planned assassination orchestrated by British intelligence, allegedly to prevent Diana from marrying a Muslim man and possibly having his child. These claims were investigated extensively and ultimately dismissed by British courts. No credible evidence supported the theory. And yet, the persistence of such ideas speaks less about proof and more about mistrust. When institutions appear opaque, conspiracy thrives in the shadows. Another factor that continues to raise eyebrows is the role of the paparazzi. Photographers were among the first at the scene, some even taking photos instead of assisting the injured. Although several were questioned and briefly detained, none were ultimately convicted of causing the crash. The image of Diana being photographed in her final moments became a symbol of media excess, a chilling reminder of how far the pursuit of exclusives can go. It forced an uncomfortable question into public consciousness. At what point does observation become participation? Medical response procedures in France also came under scrutiny. French emergency services prioritize stabilizing patients at the scene rather than rushing them to hospital, a protocol that differs from practices in other countries. Some critics argue that this delay cost Diana her life. Others insist that her internal injuries were so severe that survival was unlikely regardless of response time. The truth sits somewhere between tragedy and limitation, but it adds another layer of uncertainty to an already complex event. As years passed, multiple investigations reaffirmed the conclusion of accidental death. The British Operation Paget inquiry examined every claim in detail and found no evidence of foul play. Still, public unease remained. Not because the facts were necessarily wrong, but because the context felt wrong. Diana's life had been defined by surveillance, pressure, and emotional conflict with powerful systems. It was difficult for many to accept that her death was merely the final coincidence in a long series of damaging encounters. What often gets lost in debates about Diana's death is the quieter truth about the environment that surrounded her. Long before the crash, Diana had been living under a level of scrutiny that few humans could endure without consequence. Her movements were tracked, her relationships speculated on, her emotional state dissected daily. The paparazzi did not invent this system, but they perfected it around her. Diana became the prototype of modern celebrity surveillance, the point where public curiosity crossed into obsession. In the aftermath of her death, something extraordinary happened. The same media that had pursued her relentlessly suddenly paused, if only briefly, to reflect. Newspapers questioned their own ethics. Editors promised restraint. The public demanded change. For a moment, it seemed as though Diana's death might force a reckoning with the machinery of fame. That moment passed, as moments often do, but its impact lingered. Modern discussions about privacy, mental health, and media responsibility still trace their roots back to her story. The royal family's response also shaped public perception. Initially reserved, even distant, their silence was interpreted by many as coldness. It was only after mounting public pressure that a televised address acknowledged the collective grief. Queen Elizabeth's speech was carefully measured, respectful, but it revealed how disconnected royal protocol had become from public emotion. Diana had exposed that gap in life, and her death made it impossible to ignore. Her funeral was watched by over 2 billion people worldwide. When her brother described her as the most hunted person of the modern age, it crystallized what many already felt. Diana was not just a victim of a car crash. She was a casualty of relentless attention. This framing does not require belief in conspiracy to be meaningful. It simply requires recognition that environments kill too, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. Diana's legacy is inseparable from the way she died, but it should not be defined by it. Her humanitarian work continues through charities and foundations inspired by her actions. Her sons, William and Harry, have spoken openly about the trauma of losing their mother in such a public way, and about the long-term effects of media intrusion. In doing so, they have extended Diana's most powerful lesson: vulnerability is not weakness, and silence rarely protects. If this story is making you rethink what you thought you knew, subscribe now. Stories like this are not about choosing sides, but about understanding the systems that shape lives and deaths in ways we rarely see clearly at first. More than 2 decades later, the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, remains unresolved in the emotional sense, even if the legal conclusions are clear. That unresolved feeling is not a failure of investigation, but a reflection of how deeply Diana had embedded herself into global consciousness. She represented a break from tradition, a challenge to cold institutions, and a reminder that compassion can coexist with status. When someone like that dies abruptly, explanation alone rarely satisfies. The enduring fascination with her death says something uncomfortable about us as well. We search for hidden hands and secret plans because randomness feels inadequate. Accepting that a woman so loved, so watched, and so symbolic could die because of a chain of poor decisions and systemic pressure is harder than believing in orchestration. Accidents feel unfair. Conspiracies, oddly, feel orderly. But reality often resists the narratives we prefer. Diana's story forces us to confront how society consumes people who shine too brightly. She was celebrated for her warmth and punished for her independence, loved for her honesty and criticized for her emotional openness. In the end, she could not outrun the very attention that made her powerful. The tunnel in Paris was not just a physical location. It was the endpoint of years spent accelerating away from an inescapable spotlight. Perhaps the most truthful way to honor Diana is not to argue endlessly about how she died, but to reflect on how she lived and what her life revealed. She showed that institutions can be challenged by empathy, that vulnerability can change public conversation, and that image is never the same as truth. Her death was tragic, but her impact was transformative. And so, when her name resurfaces, as it inevitably does, it is worth remembering that behind the theories and the headlines was a woman trying to reclaim control over her own story. She did not succeed in that final moment, but she changed the world enough that we are still talking, still questioning, and still learning. If you value narratives that go beyond the obvious and refuse to simplify complex truths, subscribe, because history is full of stories like this, waiting to be told with clarity, depth, and respect. Time has a strange way of softening facts while sharpening emotions, and nowhere is that more evident than in the way Diana's death continues to live in public memory. As years passed, new generations encountered her not through live broadcasts or tabloid covers, but through documentaries, dramatizations, and online debates that blurred the line between history and interpretation. Each retelling added a layer, sometimes informative, sometimes distorted, but always charged with emotion. Diana became less a historical figure and more a symbol, a canvas onto which people projected their mistrust of power, their anger at the media, and their longing for authenticity in public life. The rise of social media only intensified this phenomenon. Clips of interviews, photographs frozen in time, and quotes often stripped of context circulate endlessly, reinforcing certain narratives while ignoring others. Diana is frequently portrayed as either a flawless saint or a tragic pawn, rarely as a complex individual navigating impossible circumstances. This simplification is understandable, but it does her no favors. The real Diana was resilient yet fragile, strategic yet impulsive, compassionate yet deeply wounded. Reducing her to a single role makes her story easier to consume, but far less truthful. It is also worth noting how much the world she lived in has changed since 1997. Today, conversations about mental health, media harassment, and personal boundaries are more open than they were during Diana's lifetime. Paparazzi behavior is more regulated, though far from eradicated. Public figures speak more freely about anxiety, trauma, and emotional strain, often citing the lessons learned from past tragedies. In many ways, Diana helped create the conditions for these shifts, even if she never benefited from them herself. Her sons have played a crucial role in reframing her legacy. Both William and Harry have emphasized the human cost of relentless exposure, not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. Their willingness to discuss therapy, grief, and vulnerability reflects a cultural shift that Diana herself helped initiate. When they speak about their mother, they do so not as an icon, but as a person who laughed, worried, and loved fiercely. That perspective cuts through decades of noise and reminds us what was truly lost. There is an irony in the fact that Diana, who struggled so much with being seen, is now viewed more clearly in retrospect than she ever was in life. Distance has allowed nuance to emerge where once there was only spectacle. Her flaws no longer diminish her. They humanize her. Her fears no longer seem irrational. They seem inevitable. And her death, while still painful to revisit, fits more coherently into the broader story of a woman caught between tradition and transformation. In the end, the story behind the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, is not a single revelation waiting to be uncovered, but a convergence of forces that collided at the worst possible moment. Media obsession, institutional rigidity, personal vulnerability, and human error all played their part. Removing any one of them might have changed the outcome. Together, they formed a pressure system that had been building for years. The crash in Paris was sudden, but the conditions that made it possible were anything but. What makes this story endure is not the mystery of unanswered questions, but the clarity of the warning it leaves behind. Diana's life and death expose the cost of turning people into symbols while denying them protection. They show how admiration can coexist with cruelty, how attention can masquerade as love, and how systems designed to observe can become systems that harm. These lessons are uncomfortable, which is why they are often resisted, but they are no less relevant today. Diana once said that she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. In that sense, she succeeded in ways no crown could guarantee. Her empathy reshaped public expectations, her honesty challenged rigid traditions, and her courage made vulnerability visible on a global stage. The tragedy is not that her life ended too soon, but that she had to endure so much to make that impact. As the years continue to pass, debates will persist, theories will resurface, and emotions will remain strong. That is inevitable. But beneath all of that lies a simpler truth worth holding on to. Diana mattered not because of how she died, but because of how she lived, and because her story forces us to confront the consequences of how we watch, judge, and consume the lives of others. And if stories like this make you pause, question, and look beyond the surface, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, because history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a mirror reflecting who we are and who we choose to become.